The winter arrived like a verdict already passed, not with howling storms at first, but with a quiet so deep it made the mountains seem hollow. In the high folds of Appalachia, where the sun often struggled to climb over ridgelines even in kinder months, the cold settled early and refused to lift its weight. By December of the early 1960s, breath turned brittle in the air, water froze in buckets beside kitchen doors, and the poor began to understand that this season was not merely weather, but something patient and watching. Coal stoves went dark one by one. Not because families forgot to feed them, but because there was nothing left to burn. The mines had closed without ceremony, leaving behind empty tipples, unpaid men, and towns that existed only because coal once demanded them. Snow buried the narrow roads until the hollows were sealed like graves, isolating families whose lives had already been reduced to careful rationing of beans, hope, and warmth. Children slept in coats. Mothers boiled the same bones twice. Fathers listened to the walls crack at night, unsure whether it was the house shrinking from the cold or something moving outside. It was said the cold behaved differently that year. It crept inward instead of down, sliding under doors, through cracks in faith and patience. Old folks whispered that it could smell poverty, that it lingered longest where bellies were empty and hands were already trembling. The first body was found just after New Year's, a woman curled beside a dead stove, eyes open, as if she had been waiting for someone who never came. Then another. Then more. No fire scars, no signs of struggle, only the quiet theft of heat, breath, and time. Church bells rang more often, but not always for funerals. Some rang as warnings, others as pleas. Aid was promised from beyond the mountains, but promises froze just as hard as everything else. At night, when the wind slid down the slopes like a living thing, people swore they heard voices woven into it, names, prayers, bargains whispered into the dark. And with every passing morning, the snow seemed deeper around the poorest homes, as though the winter itself had chosen where to feed. The winter did not announce itself with drama or warning, which made it all the more terrifying. One week, the mountains still breathed damp autumn air, leaves rotting softly into the soil, creeks running thin but alive. The next, the sky hardened into a pale, metallic gray that refused to break. Old men who had worked the seams since boyhood said they felt it first in their joints, a pressure that sank into bone like a promise of pain. Snow did not fall gently, it arrived sideways, sharp as ground glass, driven by winds that screamed through the hollows and made the trees groan as if they were waking something buried beneath their roots. Within days, the narrow mountain roads vanished under drifts taller than fences. The paths that families depended on to reach town, to barter, to beg, or simply to be seen, were erased as if they had never existed. Plows never reached the highest settlements, and even if they had, the ice came so fast it sealed the ground beneath into something harder than stone. Telephone lines sagged and snapped under the weight of frost. Radios hissed and then fell silent. What little connection the poor had to the outside world was cut cleanly, leaving them alone with the cold and with each other. The temperature dropped so low that breath itself became dangerous. Lungs burned with each inhale, and exhaled air crystallized instantly, frosting scarves and beards into stiff masks. Water froze inside pipes, split them open, and spilled uselessly onto kitchen floors where it turned to ice before it could be wiped away. Even the animals sensed the change. Dogs howled through the nights, cattle pressed together until some suffocated beneath the weight of warmth-seeking bodies, and birds vanished entirely, leaving the mornings unnaturally quiet. What made this winter different was not only its severity, but its timing. It arrived before families had prepared, before coal sheds were full, before woodpiles were stacked high enough to survive weeks of isolation. Many had planned to stretch what little they had until late December, expecting time they were never given. The cold took that time away. It came early, stayed late, and deepened with a cruelty that felt deliberate. Fires that once warmed entire rooms now barely thawed hands held inches from the flame. People began to speak of the winter as though it were a thinking thing. It seemed to know where the poorest lived, settling heavier over their roofs, piling snow against their doors, sealing them inside with dwindling supplies and rising fear. Night fell earlier, or so it felt, and when darkness came, it carried a silence so thick it pressed against the ears. In that silence, families listened to the wind circle their homes, testing for weakness, learning their names, waiting for the moment when the cold would no longer need to knock to be let in. The shutdown came without ceremony, without a whistle blown or a warning nailed to a post. One morning, men walked the familiar paths toward the mine entrances and found the gates chained, the offices empty, the company signs already half buried in snow. No notices had reached the hollers in time, and even if they had, there was nowhere else to go. Coal had been the only reason these towns existed, the only work that ever reached this high into the mountains, and when it stopped, it took wages, credit, and survival with it in a single, silent stroke. Storekeepers who had once extended trust on a man's word began refusing accounts. The ledgers were already thick with unpaid months, and without the promise of another payday, there was nothing left to believe in. Shelves thinned quickly. Flour disappeared first, then lard, then kerosene. What remained was priced far beyond what idle hands could afford. Families rationed down to a single meal a day, stretching beans with water, cornmeal with hope, convincing children that hunger was temporary even as their own stomachs twisted into constant knots. Heat became the cruelest loss. Coal bins stood empty beside homes that had been built around the assumption that fuel would always be close. Wood was scarce in winter, and what could be cut was green and burned poorly, filling rooms with smoke instead of warmth. Stoves that once glowed steadily now flickered weakly, consuming scraps of furniture, broken crates, anything that might burn. The smell of charred wood and desperation hung in the air, seeping into clothes, bedding, and skin. As the snow deepened, the absence of work began to change people. Men who had measured their lives in shifts and tonnage now measured them in hours of daylight and degrees of cold. Pride eroded faster than supplies. Some walked miles through drifts to ask for help from neighbors who had even less. Others stayed inside, ashamed, listening to their children cough through the night. Women traded family heirlooms, wedding rings, even winter coats for sacks of coal dust and half-spoiled food. The companies did not return. No trucks climbed the icy roads. No relief came down the slopes. It became clear that the mines had not closed for the season, but for good, abandoning entire communities to weather, hunger, and silence. The poor understood then that they were no longer workers waiting for recall, but excess lives left behind in a landscape that had finished using them. Without wages, without heat, without food, winter tightened its grip, turning unemployment into a slow, invisible execution carried out in kitchens, bedrooms, and darkened rooms where the fire had gone out hours ago. The first deaths did not come with panic or noise, which made them harder to recognize for what they were. In the beginning, people assumed illness, exhaustion, or simple bad luck, the kinds of things mountain families had always endured without naming as tragedy. It was only when patterns began to form that fear took root. A woman was found sitting upright beside her stove, hands folded in her lap, as if waiting for warmth that never arrived. A week later, an elderly man was discovered kneeling at the foot of his bed, his breath having frozen inside his chest sometime before dawn. Their faces carried no violence, only a strange calm that unsettled those who looked too closely. Word traveled slowly through snow-choked hollers, but when it did, it arrived heavy with dread. Each household began to replay the final hours of those who had died, searching for warnings they might have missed. Had the fire burned too low? Had there been food left uneaten? Were they already weakened by hunger when the cold slipped in and finished the work? No one knew exactly when death came, only that it did so quietly, without the struggle people expected from something so final. What disturbed the living most was how the bodies were positioned. Many were found with hands clasped, heads bowed, or eyes open toward the ceiling, frozen in gestures that resembled prayer or surrender. Some swore they had tried to get up, that they had felt the cold urging them to lie still, to rest just a little longer. Others whispered that the dead had chosen these positions themselves, instinctively curling into postures meant to preserve heat, though there was no warmth left to preserve. As the count rose, the community ran out of ways to explain it. Doctors could not reach the highest settlements, and even if they had, there were no resources left to offer. Coffins were impossible to build with frozen ground and limited wood. Bodies were wrapped in quilts and stored in sheds, porches, and unheated rooms, waiting for a thaw that might never come. Children learned to walk past the dead without asking questions, their eyes lowered, their voices hushed. Rumors filled the silence where certainty should have been. Some claimed the cold itself was killing selectively, sparing those with full bellies and steady fires while claiming the weakest first. Others believed the deaths were a punishment, though no one could say for what sin. The idea that terrified people most was the simplest one, that freezing to death did not always feel like a fight. That sometimes it felt like peace, like sleep, like finally being allowed to stop struggling. And once that thought took hold, it became as dangerous as the cold itself, because it suggested that the winter did not need force to claim its victims, only patience, hunger, and the slow erosion of the will to keep moving, to keep feeding the fire, to keep believing that morning would bring anything other than more snow and another name added to the quiet list of the dead. As the deaths continued, language began to change, shaped by fear and the need to give shape to something that could not be touched. People stopped calling it just the cold. They spoke instead of a hunger that wore frost for a face, a creeping presence that moved through the hollers looking not for bodies, but for need. It was said this chill did not waste itself on those who were comfortable. It lingered where cupboards were bare, where fires burned low, where hope had thinned to a fragile thread. The phrase hunger cold passed from mouth to mouth, half superstition, half confession, because it named what everyone already felt in their bones. Those who still had enough coal noticed strange things. Their fires seemed to hold longer, their rooms stayed just warm enough through the night. But in poorer homes, the cold behaved differently. Frost formed on the inside walls, tracing delicate patterns over family photographs and Bible verses. Breath fogged the air even beside the stove. Blankets felt damp and heavy, as if they absorbed the chill rather than kept it out. Mothers swore that no matter how tightly they wrapped their children, the cold always found a way in, settling into small bodies first. Stories began circulating of families who had shared what little they had, only to suffer the worst of it days later. Others whispered that the winter could smell generosity, that it punished kindness because kindness weakened survival. These rumors bred suspicion in places that had once depended on shared labor and mutual aid. Doors stayed closed. Knocks went unanswered. People weighed the risk of helping a neighbor against the certainty of losing their own heat, and the hunger cold seemed to grow stronger with every choice made out of fear. At night, when the wind slid down the mountain faces and pressed against windows, some claimed it carried a voice, low and coaxing. It promised rest, promised an end to pain and hunger, promised warmth that did not require fuel. Those who were already weak said the voice felt familiar, almost kind, as though it understood how tired they were. In the mornings, people spoke quietly of neighbors who had gone to bed determined to endure and were found still and cold by sunrise. The idea that the cold could choose its victims unsettled everyone. It suggested that survival was no longer a matter of effort alone, but of invisible judgments passed in the dark. Ministers tried to preach against such thinking, calling it fear dressed up as folklore, but even they struggled to deny what their own eyes had seen. The poorest families died first and fastest, and the pattern was too clear to ignore. As belief in the hunger cold spread, it began to shape behavior. People hoarded food even when it meant children went hungry. Fires were kept burning long after supplies should have been saved, simply to prove resistance. Desperation sharpened into paranoia. The winter no longer felt like an enemy that could be fought, but like a presence that listened, waited, and fed on deprivation itself, growing colder and more patient as the poor weakened, until the line between superstition and lived experience blurred into something that felt undeniable and alive. As fear spread, the churches became the last places people believed might offer protection, not only from the cold but from whatever judgment seemed to ride with it. On Sundays and on days when no one could remember what day it was anymore, families trudged through snow toward small wooden buildings perched on ridges and crossroads. Inside, the air filled with damp coats, hunger, and whispered prayers. Pews overflowed with the poor, their faces drawn and gray, hands cracked and trembling as they clutched hymnals more for warmth than faith. They prayed not for miracles, but for endurance, for the strength to last another night. The sermons grew darker as the winter deepened. Ministers spoke of trials, of faith tested in fire and ice, of suffering that refined the soul. But beneath the scripture was an unspoken understanding that prayer alone could not fill empty stoves. Collection plates passed through the pews returned nearly empty, not because hearts were hard, but because pockets were. Candles burned low, sometimes extinguished by drafts slipping through warped walls, and even God seemed distant in the bitter cold. Beyond the churches, a different response took shape. In the lower towns and better-built houses, doors began to close. Those with means feared that need itself was contagious, that opening a door once would invite an endless line of starving bodies. Rumors of sickness, madness, and the hunger cold fed this fear. Windows were shuttered. Fires were kept bright but hidden behind thick curtains. When knocks came after dark, they were often ignored, leaving silhouettes hunched in the snow until they moved on or did not. This division cut deeper than hunger. Families who had once shared meals and labor now measured one another by what they still had. A full coal bin became a secret. A warm house became a liability. Children were warned not to speak of what was inside their homes. Charity, once a source of pride, was recast as foolishness, even danger. The cold did not need to isolate people, fear did that work for it. Some churches attempted to organize shelter, but space was limited and resources thinner by the day. Arguments broke out over who deserved warmth most. The elderly or the young. The sick or the strong. Each choice carried guilt, and guilt hardened into resentment. Those turned away sometimes cursed the doors that closed on them, words cracking in the frozen air like breaking branches. By midwinter, it was clear that belief and survival were no longer aligned. Faith offered comfort but not coal. Kindness carried consequences few could afford. The mountains filled with the sound of hymns on Sunday mornings and silence the rest of the week, and between those two extremes, a quiet understanding settled in. The winter was not only freezing bodies, but testing how much compassion could be stripped away before people stopped recognizing one another as neighbors at all. When word spread that help was coming from beyond the mountains, it moved through the hollers like a fragile spark. Someone had spoken to a county official. Someone else had heard a radio signal before it went dead. Trucks, they said, loaded with food, coal, blankets, and medicine, would climb the passes as soon as weather allowed. For families who had begun to count survival in hours rather than days, the idea of relief became something to hold on to, a reason to keep fires alive just a little longer and stomachs enduring a little more hunger. The convoy set out before dawn, its drivers unfamiliar with the mountain roads in winter, trusting maps that did not account for drifts, washed-out bridges, and switchbacks turned to glass. Snow fell steadily as they climbed, thickening the air until headlights revealed only a narrow tunnel of white. The mountains closed in around them, tall and silent, absorbing sound and light alike. Somewhere along the ascent, radio contact weakened, then failed entirely. Those waiting below never heard the last message, only that the trucks had been delayed and would arrive soon. They never did. Days passed, then weeks. No engines echoed through the hollers. No supplies appeared at church steps or storefronts. People strained to hear any sign of movement beyond the wind, but the mountains offered nothing in return. Some believed the convoy had turned back, frightened by the weather. Others insisted it had pressed on and been swallowed by the passes, buried beneath snow so deep it erased even the road itself. Speculation grew darker as desperation sharpened. A few claimed to have seen tracks leading off the main road, veering into forest where no trail should have been. Others said they heard engines at night, distant and muffled, as though moving beneath the earth. The idea that the convoy had vanished without trace fed the growing belief that the mountains themselves were hostile, that they protected no one but their own cold silence. For the starving communities, the disappearance of the relief trucks carried a deeper meaning. It confirmed what many had already feared, that the outside world had either forgotten them or decided they were not worth the risk. Hope, once offered, became another thing taken away. People stopped watching the roads. Children stopped asking when the food would come. Fires were allowed to die earlier in the evenings, supplies conserved no longer for rescue but for delay. The loss of the convoy also fueled anger. Some cursed the officials who had promised aid. Others blamed the drivers for attempting the journey at all. A few turned that anger inward, seeing the vanished trucks as proof that expecting help was itself a kind of weakness. Trust in institutions, already thin, froze solid and cracked apart. As winter tightened its grip, the missing convoy took on a ghostly presence in local stories. It became a symbol of interrupted mercy, of help that came close enough to be believed in but never close enough to save anyone. In a season already defined by absence, the disappearance of those trucks marked the moment when many stopped believing that survival would come from anywhere beyond the mountains, leaving them alone with the cold, the dead, and the growing certainty that no one was coming to pull them out of it. As isolation deepened and hope thinned, people began to notice changes that could not be explained by hunger or cold alone. Nights grew longer, not by the clock but by the mind, stretching endlessly between dusk and dawn. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sound of wind slipping through the trees like breath drawn too close to the ear. It was during these hours that the first reports surfaced, spoken hesitantly, often prefaced with shame. Someone had heard their name carried on the air, soft and unmistakable, calling them from outside when no one should have been there. At first, these accounts were dismissed as exhaustion. Hunger starved the body, cold dulled the senses, and grief warped perception. But the stories multiplied, and they shared unsettling similarities. The voices never shouted. They whispered. They did not command or threaten. They invited. They sounded like loved ones long dead, or like neighbors who had recently been buried, their tones familiar enough to stir memory and trust. Those who heard them said the wind seemed to pause, holding the sound steady just long enough to be understood. Some followed the voices to their doors before catching themselves, hands already on the latch, hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and relief. Others claimed they stepped outside and felt an immediate calm wash over them, a warmth that did not come from heat but from surrender. In the mornings, footprints were sometimes found leading away from homes, trailing off into snowfields where no return path existed. In a few cases, the people who left were found miles away, frozen beneath open sky, faces peaceful, eyes closed as if they had lain down willingly. The voices became part of nightly dread. Families barred doors not only to keep out the cold but to keep loved ones in. Children were told to ignore anything they heard after dark, no matter how real it sounded. Couples slept in shifts, one staying awake to watch the other, afraid that weariness might loosen the mind's grip on reality. Even so, the wind always found a way in, threading through cracks, chimneys, and dreams. Ministers spoke against listening, warning that desperation made people vulnerable to deception, whether natural or spiritual. But even they admitted that the wind behaved strangely, rising suddenly around certain homes, then fading as if satisfied. The idea took hold that the winter was learning, that it understood how to use memory and longing as tools sharper than ice. As more people vanished into the night, the community's fear shifted from passive dread to active vigilance. Every sound became suspect. Every whisper carried weight. Silence itself grew threatening, because it often preceded the wind's return. In a season already marked by death, the voices represented something worse. The possibility that survival was not only being taken by force, but being coaxed away, one exhausted soul at a time, by a winter that no longer needed to freeze bodies when it could simply persuade them to stop resisting and step willingly into the cold darkness beyond their doors. By late winter, death had become so common that the living were forced into grim routines they never imagined performing. The ground was frozen solid, harder than iron, resisting shovels and picks with a cruelty that mirrored the season itself. Graves could not be dug deep enough, sometimes not at all, and bodies accumulated in sheds, barns, and church basements, wrapped in quilts stiff with frost. When the earth finally yielded in shallow patches, communal graves were carved out of necessity rather than choice, wide enough to hold several at once, marked only by wooden boards that cracked in the cold. Funerals lost their formality. There were no processions, no extended prayers, only hurried words spoken through scarves while fingers numbed and breath turned white. Grief had to be efficient. Tears froze before they fell. Children stood beside parents, watching neighbors lowered into frozen soil, learning that death could be ordinary, almost routine. The living stopped asking who would be next and began asking only how many more could be carried before spring. Then the graves began to empty. It was subtle at first, a count that did not quite match memory. A body missing from a stack. A space in a trench where someone had been laid the day before. Snow disturbed in ways the wind could not explain. Panic spread quietly, because no one wanted to say what they suspected. Animals, some said, driven mad by hunger. Shifting earth. Mistakes made in exhaustion. But these explanations failed to satisfy, especially when the missing were always recent, always unburied long enough for the ground to remember their warmth. Whispers returned, darker than before. Some believed the winter was not finished with the dead, that it claimed them twice, once for the body and once for something else that could still be taken. Others feared the living, imagining desperate acts too shameful to name. No one accused anyone directly, but eyes lingered longer, trust thinning like everything else. The disappearances fed the sense that order itself was breaking down. Death was no longer final. The boundary between rest and unrest blurred, leaving the living uncertain what safety even meant. Families began guarding the dead, keeping bodies inside homes until burial was unavoidable, candles burning through the night despite dwindling fuel. The smell of death became a constant presence, mixing with smoke and cold until it felt woven into the air. Each missing body reinforced the belief that the winter was active, not passive. That it took offense at being denied what it believed was owed to it. The graves, once symbols of closure, became sites of dread, places where the living expected absence rather than rest. In a season already stripped of certainty, the vanishing dead erased one of the last remaining comforts, the idea that suffering ended when life did. And as snow continued to fall over disturbed ground, smoothing over evidence as if nothing had ever been there, the people of the mountains understood that even burial could no longer protect them from whatever was moving through the cold, patient enough to reach beyond death itself. By the time the winter had reached its deepest hold, stories circulated of a witness who claimed to have seen the truth behind the relentless cold. He was a man neither young nor particularly strong, a miner whose body had already been hollowed by work and hunger. He spoke rarely at first, and when he did, his words trembled as though even saying them aloud might summon the thing he had glimpsed. He described the winter not as weather, not as mere frost or snow, but as a living presence, something patient and intelligent, feeding on more than exposure or malnutrition. It learned. It remembered. It chose. The people who heard him could not decide whether to fear him or pity him, because his certainty carried a weight the cold itself seemed to obey. He told of wandering the ridges one night, searching for a neighbor who had failed to return from the well. The snow was deep, the wind a howling chorus that seemed to follow him, circling, pushing, whispering names he did not know yet felt he should. And then he said he saw it, a shape that was neither solid nor entirely formless, coalescing from the air and the snow, a shadow that moved with intent, stopping briefly at each abandoned house as if inspecting what remained inside. It did not walk or crawl. It flowed. It paused at the warmest homes, lingered at the empty cupboards, and left only silence behind. The witness insisted that the winter was drawn to neglect and cruelty as much as to weakness. Those who had abandoned neighbors or hoarded food were visited first, their houses chilled with a precision that made even coal stoves struggle. Those who had offered help, however meager, often survived longer, though never entirely untouched. Hunger, frost, and death became tools of teaching, instruments used with an almost conscious purpose. It was not merely the absence of life that it desired, but the testimony of how lives were lived in its shadow. People argued over the man's account, some calling him deluded, others believing that his words explained what no other explanation could. The idea that a winter could be sentient, feeding on neglect and human frailty, reshaped how survivors moved through their days. Meals were shared sparingly but deliberately. Fires were tended constantly. Every door closed in fear of the cold also symbolically closed a promise to be vigilant, to resist whatever intelligence hid in the whiteness beyond the window. Even those who doubted him could not escape the sense that the winter was watching, judging, learning. Every night, when snow drifted against the windows and wind rattled through the hollows, the living felt it pressing not only on their bodies but on their choices, their morals, their very capacity to endure. The mountain itself seemed alive with awareness, and the witness's testimony became less a story and more a lens through which everyone began to interpret the cold's cruelty, until survival itself felt like obedience to a force far older and wiser than any human could hope to outlast. When the first signs of spring appeared, they did little to comfort the people who had survived. The snow began to recede unevenly, leaving jagged drifts and frozen ponds that reflected pale sunlight onto streets still empty of life. The mountains, once familiar and navigable in memory, seemed transformed, stranger and more silent than ever. Trees that had groaned and bent under the weight of winter now stood like brittle sentinels, their branches stripped bare, their bark cracked, and their hollers echoing with a ghostly quiet. Those who emerged from their homes found landscapes that no longer resembled the places they had once known, and every footstep across thawing ground reminded them of absence, of names and faces that would never return. The living moved cautiously, measuring the distance between houses, checking doors, peering into abandoned barns. The experience of surviving had changed them, slowed them, sharpened their senses to a level of awareness they had never needed before. Every shadow seemed to hold memory, every cold gust of wind a reminder of what had been endured. Snowmelt revealed things that had been hidden, discarded boots, broken tools, and unmarked graves where the frost had finally released its grip. Each discovery reinforced the understanding that the mountains kept records in silence and that some knowledge was written only in absence and loss. Families tried to resume life, but nothing could return fully to what had been. Gardens planted in spring struggled against soil compacted by months of frost. Streams, swollen with melting snow, ran cold and swift, washing away any trace of paths that had guided people through the snow. Children, some of whom had grown thin and pale from weeks of near starvation, now watched adults move with a new caution, as though every action could trigger another disaster. There was no festival of survival, no celebration, only quiet endurance and a shared, unspoken grief. The dead remained uncounted, their numbers remembered only in stories whispered beside stoves and in church pews. The mountains had claimed them, and the living were left to carry their absence. Even the strongest felt the weight of guilt, a persistent companion to the ongoing struggle to eat, to warm, to rebuild. Trust, once fractured by fear and hunger, was slow to return, and the hollers themselves seemed to have absorbed the winter's lessons, becoming places where silence was not merely golden but necessary for survival. By the time the snow had fully melted, the hollers were forever altered. Paths had changed, trees had fallen, and homes had been abandoned or lost entirely to the frost. Survivors moved through a landscape that held echoes of voices carried by the wind, of shadows pressed against walls, of neighbors lost to night or cold. The mountains, patient and unyielding, retained their power over the living, shaping memory and expectation alike. Spring offered warmth, but it could not undo the transformation wrought by a winter that had not only taken lives but had taught the people of Appalachia a lesson in the quiet, relentless cruelty of patience and observation, leaving behind scars both seen and unseen in a land that would never again feel entirely safe or familiar.